My face is black is true, starting at page 14. Free Negroes in the North had established the African Methodist Episcopal Church. After the war, separate black churches proliferated as African Americans sought to exercise autonomy over their religious lives. They wanted to have their own facilities and to hear from their own preachers who, through God, had called them, had been prevented from preaching freely during slavery. Now ex-slaves wanted to worship in their own way. They saw choice in the matter as one of several essential differences between slavery and freedom, beginning in contraband camps in Rutherford County and elsewhere in the South. Separate African American denominations soon appeared as Southern and Northern churches united. In 1867, Baptists organized the Consolidated American Baptist Convention, which was absorbed by the National Baptist Convention in 1880. The representatives of 3 million members met in Atlanta, Georgia in 1895 and formed the National Baptist Convention of the United States. Southern Methodists formed a new denomination in 1870, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. As new denominations were formed, the African American Episcopal Church spread in the South. Most of the congregations, especially rural ones, were small and could rarely pay ministerial salaries. Consequently, black ministers had to hold a full-time, non-ministerial jobs, as did House's brother and brother-in-law. Most also usually served 2 or more churches. Despite their financial poverty, Callie and other freed children gained some primary school education. Northerners, moved by the ex-slaves' plight, used private charitable resources to augment the freed people's own efforts to obtain an education, and philanthropic agencies sent Yankee school arms to operate schools in the South. By 1869, 79 Northern Aid Societies supported African American schools in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, had spent more than $5 million on black education by 1871, and by 1870, the Bureau operated 4,239 schools with 9,300 teachers and almost 250,000 pupils. By early 1865, there were 8 teachers teaching 500 black children in Murfreesboro, the Rutherford County seat. A pupil-teacher ratio of more than 60 to 1. We're going to share a picture. This is the Freedmen's Bureau. Let's continue. African Americans in House's community, like those elsewhere, were so intensely desired education that they immediately began to teach one another. They believed there could be no real freedom without education. One Tennessee ex slave recalled that the white folk didn't want them to learn nothing. If they saw a slave pick up a piece of paper with writing on it, they would yell, put that down. You want to get into our business?" Freed people built their own schools out of their meager resources. They purchased lots and raised money by subscription to pay for the materials to erect buildings, most of which had neither water nor lavatories on site. Blacks paid the salaries of northern white teachers, raised money for their boarded black teachers in their own homes, and paid tuition and fees at Freedmen's Bureau schools. The schools used tuition and fees at Freedmen Bureau schools. The schools used a primer published by the American Tract Society that taught reading, Christian morality, civic duty. In March 1867, the Tennessee legislature passed a public school law to support schools by a state property tax. The Freedmen's Bureau schools gradually came under the control of the state. But in 1869, the state repealed the law and left education to the counties. Obtaining an education put Callie and other black students at considerable risk. While African Americans passionately desired education, some whites just as adamantly wanted to limit their opportunities. These whites understood that for blacks, education could lead to empowerment. During the early years of Reconstruction, Southern whites burned schools, 37 in Tennessee in 1869, and insulted and abused white teachers of African Americans. Some Southern whites feared that educated African Americans would undermine white supremacy and challenged entrenched beliefs about genetic, physical, and mental superiority of whites over blacks. So let's show some of that. I do have a little bit of footage on that. Yeah, they used to burn the schools, the freedmen schools, even to this day. If you're reading a book, just go try this. Read a book of anything around white people. Just read a book around them. They're going to try to get all into your business, asking you what you're reading. That's something white people still do to this day. They just want to know what you're reading. They want to get into what you're doing. They just try to come up with conversations to pretend like they're caring about what you're doing, but really they're just getting all into your business. So this is something that's genetic, and it's a carryover from the culture. They feel threatened every time we get something. So we need to understand that, and this is coming from deep-seated ideas. So let's go back. Let's start reading again. Education might also enable blacks to keep track of their wages, credits, and debits. In, in 1869, the Tennessee legislature decided that counties could, but did not have to, levy taxes to provide separate schools for blacks and whites. In 1872, the Freedom Bureau relinquished entire control and responsibility to the states and the counties. Education as a form of compensation for slavery was abandoned, and it's not a compensation for slavery. Despite the state and county government's neglect, until at least the early 1900s, African Americans in Rutherford County provided their own schools. They received little help from the government at any level. African American church congregants built structures to use for both education and religious services. During Callie's early years, the buildings were generally one room with a pot-bellied stove for heat. The teachers would sometimes cook a meal of soup or beans. In 1879, the state mandated a course in agriculture, along with reading, writing, arithmetic, and civics. The school term was barely 6 months long. One teacher taught all grades using primers and large cards with simple religious wording. Students were of all ages, including adults who were learning to read and write for the first time. Because of the lack of resources and their poverty, African American students often attended school for only short spurts between their house and labor during a few months of the school term. The education they received was also problematic because of the skepticism of some Northern teachers about the ability of their charges and the cultural differences between teachers and students. Local African American teachers were always in short supply, if available at all. Many schools lacked room or teachers for the numbers of pupils who tried to attend. Churches established colleges to train African American teachers, beginning with Fisk University in Nashville. In the 1860s, responding to the immediate need after the war, the Freedom Bureau created a number of short-term institutes to prepare basically train teachers quickly. However, the state of Tennessee did not fund a college for African Americans until 1909. W.E.B. Du Bois, born in 1868, taught in a rural Tennessee school in the early 1880s and described the schoolhouse as a log hut used to store corn, with a fireplace instead of a stove and benches made of rough planks without backs. No blackboards, and a great distance for the children to walk. But he said, I loved my school, and the fine faith the children had in the wisdom of their teacher was truly marvelous. We read and spelled together, wrote a little, picked flowers, and listened to stories of the world beyond the hill. When House became an advocate for pensions, she told ex-slaves that their right to ask for a compensation law was guaranteed by the government. She pointed out that the Constitution of the United States grants to citizens the privilege of peaceably assembling themselves together and petition their grievances. She had learned this lesson despite her very rudimentary schooling available her rudimentary schooling available in the Rutherford County schools. During Callie House's youth, African Americans in Tennessee wanted land, schooling, and religious freedom, but they also wanted to participate in electoral politics. Before the Civil War was over, blacks held conventions that pushed for abolition and the right to vote. The organizers were men who had been free before the war or freed in the military, some whom were Baptist or AME ministers. In October 1864, 144 blacks from 18 states, meeting in Syracuse, New York, in a national convention of colored citizens of the United States, issued an address to the people of the United States. Written by Frederick Douglass, they asserted, "We want the elective franchise in all the states now in the Union, and the same in all states as may come into the Union hereafter. The position of that right is the keystone to the arch of human liberty." The position of that right is the keystone to the arch of human liberty, and without that the whole may stand forever. The group also demanded abolition and lamented the abandonment of the abandonment of promise of land to the freed people. They organized a national equal rights league to continue the work. 5 delegates from Tennessee attended that convention. I'm going to read that again just to make sure we get that right. So, Frederick Douglass, they asserted, this is this group, "We want the elective franchise in all the states now in the Union, and the same in all such states as may come into the Union hereafter. The position of that right is the keystone to the arch of human liberty." So righteousness, right. So right. Without that, the whole may at any moment fail to the ground, while with it the liberty may stand forever. So righteousness, basically, if you don't have righteousness, your whole system falls to the ground. With it, you will stand forever. The group also demanded abolition and lamented the abandonment of the promise of. They lamented, so lamentation meaning they were angry or they didn't like. They lamented the abandonment of the promise of land to the freed people. So they were wanting reparations even before enslavement had been over. They organized a national equal rights league to continue the work. 5 delegates from Tennessee attended that convention. African Americans showed immediate interest in the right to vote and hold political office. In Louisiana, where the Union captured New Orleans in the summer of 1862, freed people of color organized early. By November 5th, 1863, a meeting of free colored persons at Economy Hall demanded political rights for themselves, but did not include the ex-slaves. Pinckney Benton Stewart, Pinchback, a Union Army Louisiana Native Guard veteran, led the speakers. African American conventions took place in most of the Confederate states during 1865. In January 1865, a convention of colored men of Louisiana organized to discuss giving support to the National Equal Rights League. From a published attendance list of 83 names, some of the wealthiest and most prominent Afro Creoles attended. Captain James Ingram, a Louisiana Native Guard hero, was elected president. The local French language newspaper that served the free colored community, La Tribune, trumpeted the solidarity between free and freed at the convention. However, the relationship between free people of color and new freed people remained uneasy. So we already had the seeds of the division in our community. The New Orleans riots, along with the passage of black codes and Confederate resurgence in the other southern states, helped to elect the congressman who passed the Reconstruction Act of March 1867, affirming African American suffrage temporarily at least. The fissure between Afro Creoles and freedmen seemed healed. In Louisiana, the Constitutional Convention established under the Act considered a 98, consisted of 98 delegates, half white and half African American, 6 of whom were former Native Guards. They enshrined universal suffrage, and universal suffrage is the right to vote in the new Constitution. Since the Union defeat of the Confederacy came early in Tennessee in 1862, just as it had in New Orleans, blacks had some freedom to act politically before those elsewhere. Memphis and Nashville also had free Negro populations that could exercise leadership. In Nashville, beginning in 1863, demonstrations for freedom and political suffrage led by free before the war, literate blacks and ministers and veterans became common. In Nashville, these men enacting the part of political citizens went to Union Party rallies. They campaigned for Lincoln in 1864, campaigned and cast their ballots at a mock polling place. In January 1865, on the same day, the Convention of Colored Men met in Louisiana. In Nashville, 62 colored citizens petitioned the white Unionist meeting in a constitutional convention there at the time to abolish slavery in the state of Tennessee because it was not in rebellion, had been exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation. Therefore, Callie, as well as large population of refugees in the cities and slaves still in rural areas, remain legally in bondage in the state. Tennessee slaves were not formally freed by the state until March 1865. After a Nashville convention held in August 1865, attended by blacks from Rutherford County and surrounding areas, the Nashville Colored Tennesseans reported how they defined their change from slaves and subordinates to persons with rights. African Americans expected whites to deal with us justly. That was a bad expectation. Tell us not that we will not work when it was out, tell us not that we will not work, when it was our toil that enriched the South. So they were calling black people lazy at this time. This is what they do. And I have a picture that outlines that, and I'm going to show that. I just want us to see, just a little bit of, I want to narrate this, and since I'm doing this in real time, of course, I have to kind of stop to, so this just shows you during this time, black people had built this country, but this narrative that black folks were lazy, they were doing this. We had built the White House. If you look at the picture here in the background, you see the entire White House back there. But this was the propaganda at that time. So it says, tell us not that we will not work, when it was our toil that enriched the South. Talk not to us of a war of races, race war, which they still call it now. For that is to say you intend commencing to butcher us. See, they're always talking about butchering black people, genociding us. Whenever you can do so with impunity. All we want is the rights of men. Give us that, and we shall not molest you. We do not intend leaving this country. No land can be fairer in our eyes than the sunny one beneath whose skies we have lived. We were born here. The same thing we're saying today, same thing we'll say. Most of us will die here. We are Americans and prouder of the fact than ever. Deal justly with us. That's all we want. That we mean to have, come what may. The Reconstruction Act of March 1867 gave black males the political rights the conventions demanded. They could vote and run for office for the first time. The Union League and political clubs, mass meetings, and speakers, as well as the selection of black registrars designed by the Freedmen's Bureau, all added to the excitement of the era. At the local level in towns and cities, they learned how to organize local councils or branches. African Americans would listen to speakers, learn the rituals, and adjourn to form a council. Those who were literate would also read newspapers and other materials aloud to the illiterate. As the meeting place of the local councils where African Americans discussed issues from politics to wages, the churches developed as political institutions. The churches were the community. Women, though they could not vote, also attended the political meetings and joined in the activism. E. Franklin Frazier described how African American women asserted themselves politically under Reconstruction. During the election of 1868, if a husband refused to wear a picture of a Republican presidential candidate, former Union General Ulysses S. Grant, around the old plantation in the presence of the old slave master and or the overseer, his wife would wear it. If he would not give it to her, she would walk all the way to town to buy, beg, or borrow one to wear. Ex-slaves saw voting and the election of new conventions and legislature with African American members as defining events. Men, women, and children crowded the audiences in the state houses. They expected a new day of opportunity and empowerment. Each of the constitutional conventions called in the southern states had African American members, but they were in a majority of the conventions in South Carolina and Louisiana. In most states, African Americans constituted a small minority. In 6 states, Native whites were in the majority. Some African American members were former slaves, and others had been free before the war. Some were immigrants from the North, and many were veterans of the Union Army. Those who spoke in conventions took a moderate conciliatory position towards white Confederates, even supporting their enfranchisement. The state constitutions approved by the Reconstruction Conventions were much more progressive than the constitutions of antebellum days. They abolished property qualifications for voting and holding office, and some ended imprisonment for debt. Slavery was formally abolished in all the constitutions they adopted. In every constitution, universal male suffrage, the right to vote, was enacted except for certain classes of former Confederates. William Whipper, an African American who immigrated from the North to serve in the Union Army and a delegate to the South Carolina Convention, even proposed women's suffrage. So William Whipper, a black man, proposed that women get the right to vote. A black man, William Whipper. Public school systems and modernized local government administrative provisions were also included. These constitutions were apparently so highly regarded that even when Reconstruction was overthrown by white supremacists, the basic provisions of the constitutions were maintained. The whites overthrew Reconstruction to regain power. They had no problem with the advanced structures of government the conventions established. So that lets you know right there that even when the white supremacists took back over and, they started doing the slave codes and the black codes, black people, the best parts of this country that make it easier to live, the black people came up with this stuff. So we want to understand that there's a lot of history here that we have to teach, we have to learn. We can't be dependent on, we have a long history of improving this nation. And, we have to have confidence in ourselves that we can do this without them. Everything that we do that's right, these people want to try to reverse it later on and then pretend like they the one that came up with it. The greatness of this country, all of these things. A lot of this stuff was started by black people. The best parts of, like even the healthcare, universal healthcare. These people try to pretend like they did everything. So we need to understand that. We're going to start back on page 25, and we'll do that. I'll try to be more consistent with it. Do this every week at least. Try to get through this book, and this is what we'll do here. So we want to understand this. It's our right to seek reparations. This is our birthright. This debt does not go away just because we don't think they're going to just give it to us. If somebody doesn't pay you money that they owe you, you don't help them. You punish them any way that you can. You don't just sit there and continue to participate and help them level up and they won't pay you. That's what you do. You throw it in their face. If you want my help, pay me my money. If you don't want to pay me my money, you get no help. I'll do it on my own, but you're not going to get my help in leveling up your system. All right? So anyway, let me know what you think about it. Share this message. Subscribe to the channel. Peace.